So the janitor thinks he found a crime? Trevor's voice carried down the hallway, loud enough for half the courthouse to hear. Relax, it was just a prank. They laughed when the courthouse worker reported the breach, calling him dramatic. Karen's son bragged that breaking into an evidence room was harmless fun. The father didn't argue. He gathered proof instead. Nobody expected the judge to turn the entire courtroom on its head. This story is about a truth they tried to bury. Before I show you the exact moment the judge asked the girl in the second row to reveal her federal badge. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. He stood there in that gray hallway, quiet as ever, letting their words hang like stale smoke. He didn't match their anger. He didn't flinch at their smirking. That calm wasn't weakness. It was memory, discipline, and something he'd promised to keep buried. Elias Ward had spent years keeping the courthouse running, without anyone noticing the precision behind his hands. After losing his federal career and his wife, he'd decided that silence was safer than brilliance. His daughter deserved stability, even if it meant scrubbing floors beneath the same justice system he once protected. He tightened a loose hinge on the evidence server room door, pretending not to hear Karen boasting to another council member about fixing the situation before it spiraled. He didn't bother correcting her. He rarely corrected anyone. People saw what they wanted to see. A maintenance tech in worn boots, not the analyst who once guarded the same kind of evidence her son had just violated. Mara stood at the end of the hallway clutching her tablet to her chest, her brow drawn tight. She'd gotten the alert before anyone else. A federal ping routed straight to her cyber cadet training app. She didn't know who triggered it at first, but when she saw Trevor sprinting past with a phone in hand, her stomach twisted. She didn't mean to report him. Her training demanded it. Her conscience demanded it. Still, the weight of it pushed her shoulders down. Elias noticed, as he always did. He didn't ask her to explain. He never forced confession out of fear. Instead, his hand rested briefly on her back in a way that said, "I'm here. You did right." But behind his quiet strength, an old ache simmered. He'd walked away from federal work to protect Mara from the chaos of losing a mother and living with a father who was always in danger. Now, danger had slipped back into their lives through a door he'd just repaired. Karen's heels clicked sharply as she approached, irritation radiating from her like heat. "Your daughter overreacted. My son didn't do anything serious. Maybe talk to her about consequences before she ruins her future over a misunderstanding." Mara shrank inward. Elias didn't. He simply lifted his tool bag, zipped it shut, and met Karen's glare with an expression that made her blink. Not aggressive, not intimidated, impossibly steady. "Security logs will be reviewed," he said, voice even. "Everything else is noise." Karen scoffed and turned away with a dramatic shake of her head, muttering something about power-tripping maintenance staff. Trevor smirked behind her, spinning his phone in hand like a trophy. Elias didn't rise to it. He never rose to noise. Instead, he guided Mara toward the exit, sensing her guilt eating at her. Outside, the late afternoon sky hung low and colorless, matching the heaviness in her breath. "It's my fault," she murmured once the doors closed behind them. "If I hadn't filed the alert, none of this would have blown up." "It's not blown up," he replied softly. "It's simply unfolding. But he's popular, connected. His mom has nothing to do with the truth." She looked at him, searching his face. His words were gentle but firm, the way he'd always been when she doubted herself. Beneath that calm, though, she sensed the shift, the same stillness he carried years ago before testifying in federal court. She recognized it now that she was old enough to understand. Later that night, while she studied for her cyber logic exam, he sat at the kitchen table, assembling the full forensic chain. Timestamps, server access logs, bypass signatures. Not anger, not revenge. Just truth arranged in a sequence no one could twist. He didn't plan to reveal anything about who he used to be. He didn't want attention, but a line had been crossed, and he knew what happens when powerful people decide the rules don't apply to them. Mara paused behind him and asked, hesitant, "Are we in trouble?" He shook his head. "We're in a process. Trouble is what people create when they lie to protect ego." She didn't fully understand the line, but she trusted the steadiness behind it. The hearing was set for Monday morning. Karen already began pulling strings, demanding leniency, insisting Trevor meant no harm. She accused courthouse staff of incompetence. She framed Elias as emotional. She claimed Mara was dramatic, but truth isn't fragile. Pressure only makes it sharper. And in his quiet apartment, with soft lamplight catching the lines beneath his eyes, Elias breathed deeply, preparing not for a fight, but for a moment he had hoped never to face again. The moment where truth steps into a room that's been trying hard not to see it. Elias didn't sleep much that night. The glow of the kitchen light had barely faded when dawn pressed through the blinds, painting the apartment in a muted gray that matched his thoughts. The hearing was still days away, yet the weight of it had already settled into his shoulders. He knew how power behaved when it felt threatened. He'd watched entire cases unravel because someone believed influence gave them immunity. Mara shuffled into the living room, hair tied in a messy knot, tablet tucked under her arm. She hesitated before speaking, unsure whether to interrupt the quiet. "Dad, do you think they'll blame you?" Her voice carried a tremor she'd tried to hide. He looked up from the stack of digital printouts he'd been rechecking. "Blame comes easy when people don't want responsibility," he said, motioning for her to sit. "But blame isn't truth." She sat across from him, drawing her knees close. "Karen said I made things worse." Her fingers tightened around the tablet. "She acted like I ruined her son's life." "You didn't ruin anything," he answered gently. "He made a choice, and choices have direction. Some lead forward, some lead into walls." "But she's already talking to everyone," Mara whispered. "The security guard, the clerk, even the deputy prosecutor. She's trying to make it look like we're lying." He nodded once, the calm in his eyes solid as stone. "That's why we don't rely on opinions. We rely on logs, timestamps, and facts." Mara swallowed, then leaned forward as if absorbing his steadiness. She trusted it, even if a part of her feared what Monday could bring. By mid-morning, the courthouse buzzed with tension long before anyone arrived for official work. Word had spread faster than any memo. Karen Whitmore's son was involved in a breach, the maintenance tech was making it formal, and the judge had refused to dismiss the hearing. Every hallway conversation ended when Elias walked by, but he never reacted. He stepped around whispers the same way he stepped around puddles, irrelevant obstacles that didn't change his path. When he approached the administrative office to finalize the evidence chain, he found Deputy Clerk Sanders waiting for him. Sanders, a man built of caffeine and impatience, lowered his voice as Elias walked closer. "Look," Sanders began, "Karen's been in here 3 times since sunrise. She wants this handled quietly." "I know," Elias replied, handing over a sealed envelope. "That's why this is time-stamped." Sanders frowned. "You're pushing this further than most people would." "I'm pushing it exactly as far as procedure requires." Behind them, 2 younger clerks exchanged glances. Karen had clearly been planting seeds, painting Elias as someone trying to make trouble, but trouble wasn't what he brought. Clarity was. Sanders reluctantly accepted the envelope. "Judge Branton asked for all raw logs by noon." "They'll be there," Elias said, turning to leave. On his way out, he crossed paths with Karen herself. She stood near the elevator in a tailored coat, hair perfect, expression sharp enough to cut glass. She intercepted him with a single step. "You're determined to make this into a scandal," she said. "Do you really want to drag your daughter through this? She's just a kid." He met her gaze without raising his voice. "She followed protocol, something your son did. Not," Karen scoffed. "It was a joke, Elias. Boys record everything these days. You're escalating it because you misunderstood the situation." "No misunderstanding," he replied. "Just documentation." A flash of irritation crossed her face, the kind that came from being unable to control a narrative. "I'm giving you a chance to walk this back," she warned, "for your daughter's sake." He stepped into the elevator calmly. "The hearing is scheduled. We'll speak there." The doors slid shut just as Karen muttered something furious under her breath. By lunchtime, the courthouse hum had sharpened into full-blown speculation. Some believed Trevor had simply wandered where he shouldn't. Others knew the server room was restricted for a reason and were quietly impressed Elias had the composure to push the case forward. A few whispered that they'd heard rumors of his past, something about federal work, something about evidence security. Nothing confirmed, nothing dismissed. Mara, meanwhile, spent her afternoon studying in the small break area Elias used during maintenance rotations. She kept her tablet near her, half afraid another alert would appear. When her father walked in, she sat up straighter. "Did they say anything?" she asked. "People always say things," he replied, placing a lunch container in front of her. "But sound isn't substance." The reassurance loosened something in her chest. "I didn't mean to make this harder." He shook his head. "You didn't make anything harder. You illuminated what was already wrong." As she ate, he reviewed the printed logs again. Precise, unshakable, irrefutable. Every line told a story Trevor couldn't overwrite with charm or privilege. Karen might try to drown the room in influence, but influence couldn't change mathematics. By the end of the day, Judge Branton's request spread. All logs, all reports, all device pings. No exceptions. That alone was enough to unsettle Karen's confidence. She preferred environments she could subtly manipulate, not structured rooms where every decision was recorded. Elias walked home with Mara at sunset, the sky streaked in deep oranges that reminded him of days long gone, days when he lived in the federal world, days when danger and duty were inseparable. The courthouse air clung to him even now, carrying old echoes he thought he'd buried. Mara broke the silence. "Dad, do you think the judge knows it was me who filed the alert?" "Yes," he answered. She inhaled sharply. "Then, what do I do at the hearing?" "You stand," he said simply, "and you tell the truth. And if they don't believe me, they will." "How do you know?" He didn't hesitate. "Because truth has weight. Lies only have volume." Mara nodded, absorbing the words the way she absorbed code, piece by piece until understanding clicked into place. Back at home, as she packed her badge and ID into her backpack, he watched her with a quiet pride he didn't voice. She was stronger than she knew, clearer than she realized, and soon, very soon, she would understand why truth could outshine arrogance, especially when the world believed she was powerless. The hearing was coming, and the first cracks in Karen's control had already begun to appear. Night settled heavy over the apartment, but sleep still refused to come. Mara's backpack sat by the door, with her ID case tucked inside, zipped up so tightly it looked more like a vault than fabric. Elias watched her double-check it twice before bed. She didn't say she was anxious. She didn't need to. Her silence had its own vocabulary. Morning arrived with a brittle chill, the kind that made sounds sharper and thoughts louder. As they stepped outside, Mara walked close to her father, not clinging, but hovering, like she needed the steady rhythm of his steps to keep her own steady. The hearing was still 2 days away, yet the tension felt pressing, immediate, almost alive. At the courthouse entrance, whispers followed them. Elias heard fragments. "Karen's furious. Judge isn't backing down. Why is maintenance involved?" But he didn't react. He'd long learned that whispers disappear faster when ignored. Mara, though, kept her eyes down. She'd never been the center of anything before. Quiet meant safety. Attention meant trouble. As they reached the service corridor, Deputy Clerk Sanders jogged toward them. "Judge Branton wants the full packet this morning," he said, slightly out of breath. "Raw logs, video captures, everything you've compiled." "It's already prepared," Elias replied. Sanders blinked. "You had it ready?" "I don't delay what needs to be done." The statement wasn't pride. It was a habit, one built from years of knowing delays could destroy the integrity of evidence. Sanders nodded and led them toward the administrative wing. Mara followed, watching her father move like someone who belonged in these halls in a way she couldn't fully name. Inside Judge Branton's chambers, the air hummed with quiet importance. Branton herself stood behind her desk, glasses low on her nose, papers spread like a battlefield overview. Her eyes lifted when Elias approached. "You work fast," she said. He didn't smile. "I work precisely." Branton studied him, not in the dismissive way others did, but with genuine curiosity. "I've been reviewing the alert logs," she said, tapping the federal notice. "There's something here that doesn't add up." Mara stiffened. Elias noticed. Branton continued. "The federal ping wasn't random. It was authenticated through a cadet-level terminal." Mara swallowed. "And whoever submitted that alert must be thoroughly verified," the judge added, eyes narrowing slightly as if testing something unspoken. Elias didn't flinch. She followed procedure. Branton's gaze shifted to Mara, softened. "I'm aware, And I appreciate accuracy over influence. The words floated in the room with quiet weight. Influence, the very thing Karen had been counting on. Branton motioned to the stack of documents. Mr. Ward, what you've compiled is extensive, more than what a typical maintenance technician would provide. Mara's breath hitched. Elias simply nodded once. I've worked in environments where documentation mattered. Branton didn't push further, not yet, but something in her expression confirmed she already suspected more about his past than he intended to reveal. As they left the chambers, they walked straight into Karen. She stood poised, polished, and deeply irritated. Judge Branton won't see me, she said sharply. Strange, isn't it, considering this entire situation is being blown out of proportion? Elias didn't engage. Karen shifted her attention to Mara. And you, she hissed, need to understand the damage you've done. You reported something you didn't even understand. Mara stepped back, but Elias moved subtly between them. That's enough, Karen scoffed, spoken like a man who doesn't realize how small his position is. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The silence he held was sharper than confrontation. She leaned in, lowering her voice. You think the judge will take your side over mine? You think she'll risk political fallout for a glorified janitor? Mara's eyes flashed with hurt, but Elias's expression didn't change. The hearing is Monday, he said. Everything will be addressed publicly. Karen bristled. She hated the word publicly. A place where charm couldn't rewrite facts and influence couldn't override integrity. As she stormed off, Sanders approached again, cheeks flushed. She's been trying to get into every office, he said quietly. Even asked for access to the video logs. Branton shut it down. Good, Elias thought, because desperation made powerful people reckless. Later in the afternoon, Elias reviewed the logs one final time, checking for anomalies. Mara sat beside him, half watching, half absorbing the ritual. Did you used to do this a lot? She asked carefully. He paused. Every day. But not here. No, not here. She wanted to ask more, but his tone gently closed that door. Instead, she exhaled. I still feel like all of this is my fault. He turned slightly. You followed the chain of responsibility. That's never wrong. But Karen thinks noise is strength. It's not. She looked down at her hands. I'm scared of the hearing. Fear is normal, he said. But truth doesn't need confidence. It needs consistency. She let his words settle into her like a code sequence finally compiling. As they headed home, a gust of cold wind pushed against them, but Mara walked a little straighter. Something about Judge Branton's calm, about her father's unshakable steadiness, grounded her. That night, after she fell asleep on the couch studying, Elias quietly placed a blanket over her and returned to the table. He stared at the server logs again, not because he doubted them, but because this case carried echoes of a past he'd hoped Mara would never touch. But she was in it now, and the courtroom would soon reveal exactly who stood on the side of truth and who was desperately trying to outrun it. Elias stayed up long after Mara drifted into sleep, the server logs glowing across his screen like old ghosts. He wasn't second-guessing the evidence. He never second-guessed data. But he could feel a familiar pull inside him, a reminder of the life he walked away from. Back then, the stakes were higher, the rooms colder, and the consequences sharper. Yet the rhythms were the same. Gather truth, secure chain of custody, prepare for scrutiny. Nothing about that part of him had faded. By sunrise, he'd already brewed coffee and packed Mara's breakfast. She woke with her hair tousled, eyes puffy, but mind sharp enough to return to the looming hearing. She joined him at the kitchen table, where his organized files lay in strict order, like a soldier's gear awaiting deployment. Dad, she murmured, touching the edge of a printed log, you act like this is something you've done 1,000 times. He paused mid-sip, then set the mug down carefully. It's something I understand, he answered. That's all. But she watched his face long enough to know there was more beneath the surface, something she wasn't ready to ask, and something he wasn't ready to say. Not yet. Not before Monday. They left the apartment early. The courthouse stood under a cold morning haze, shadows stretching long across the pavement. The building felt different now, alive with tension, charged with rumors, sharpened by expectation. As they walked inside, More eyes followed them than before, some curious, some skeptical, some quietly sympathetic. In the lobby, Elias stopped at the security desk to sign in. Officer Ramirez, an older guard with a calm demeanor, leaned forward. "She's been here since dawn," Ramirez whispered. "Karen?" Elias asked. Ramirez gave a slow nod. "Hovering, asking questions, trying to access parts of the building she doesn't normally care about." Elias thanked him with a brief nod. He didn't need to ask why. Influence always panicked when it sensed truth gaining traction. As they headed toward the elevator, Mara tugged lightly on his sleeve. "Dad, what if Karen convinces everyone before the hearing even starts?" "Convincing isn't the same as proving," he said, "and fear talks louder than honesty. That's all she has right now. Volume." Mara didn't fully understand why those words steadied her, but they did. His confidence didn't come from stubbornness. It came from experience. On the third floor, they found Karen already cornering a junior prosecutor, her voice sharp enough to slice through the hum of morning chatter. "And I'm telling you," she insisted, "this whole thing got blown out of proportion by that girl and her father. You know how these things go. Overreaction at its finest." The prosecutor nodded awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable. Karen turned just as Elias approached, her expression shifting from irritation to hostility. "So," she said, arms crossing, "you're still moving forward with this, even after everything I've said? After I tried to do the right thing and spare your daughter embarrassment?" Mara stiffened beside him. Elias answered evenly. "My daughter isn't embarrassed. She followed the protocol the system asked her to follow." Karen scoffed. "Protocol? She's a child with a tablet. That doesn't make her an expert." Mara's cheeks flushed, but she held her ground. Elias didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "No," he said. "Her expertise comes from accuracy. The tablet is just a tool." The prosecutor glanced between them, clearly realizing this wasn't a petty disagreement. This was a collision between truth and entitlement. Karen, annoyed by the lack of immediate submission, shook her head dramatically. "You're going to regret turning this into a spectacle," she snapped. "I'll make sure of it." Elias didn't respond. Instead, he turned to Mara. "Let's go. We've done what we need to do today." They headed down the hall, leaving Karen fuming. Her frustration was a sign, a crack in her certainty. Later that afternoon, Elias worked quietly inside the server room. He adjusted cables, tightened connectors, and reviewed access points. It was his usual maintenance route, but today he moved with sharper purpose. Every step, every adjustment, every check reinforced his belief that the system deserved better than shortcuts and excuses. Mara waited nearby, sitting on a bench outside the room. She watched him through the half-open door, noticing the way his hands moved, precise, confident, methodical. Not like a maintenance worker guessing his way through unfamiliar equipment, but like someone who had built, defended, and trusted systems like this for years. She thought of the emails she'd received from her cyber cadet mentors, the detailed steps, the emphasis on integrity, the value of proper documentation. Watching him adjust a server port with surgical accuracy, she felt a realization ripple through her. He knows this, all of this. Not like someone who learned recently, but like someone who lived inside it. She didn't ask her questions yet, but the outline of an answer had already begun to take shape. When work ended, they walked home in silence. Not heavy silence, reflective silence. Mara kept glancing at him, wondering if the hearing would unravel all the things he'd kept quiet since her mother passed away. As they climbed the apartment stairs, he finally spoke. "You've been thinking all day," he said. She nodded. "About everything. That's normal. But are you sure you're ready for what Monday might bring?" He paused before unlocking the door. "Truth is always ready," he said. "People are the ones who need time." Inside, she set her backpack down and sat at the table. He followed, placing a new set of printed logs beside her. "Tomorrow we rest," he said. "Monday we speak." She nodded, confidence inching forward inside her. She wasn't ready for everything, but she was ready for the truth. And with the hearing only one sunrise away, the quiet before the storm had already begun to tremble. Monday arrived with a restless sky, clouds shifting fast, as if the weather itself anticipated what was about to happen. Elias and Mara left the apartment early, walking side by side in a silence that felt less like fear and more like readiness. Mara clutched her backpack strap tightly, thumb brushing over the hidden outline of her ID case. She wasn't trembling like she had days before. The uncertainty was still there, but something steadier anchored her now. When they approached the courthouse, the atmosphere was different. People weren't whispering in speculation anymore. They were waiting, watching. The hearing had become the building's morning pulse. Even the security guard straightened when Elias walked through, nodding with a respect that hadn't existed the previous week. As they passed through the halls, Mara noticed groups of staff huddled together. Some whispered low. Some glanced at her with curiosity. A few looked away, as if unsure of which side they'd chosen too early. She walked closer to her father, steadying her breath. Judge Branton had requested everyone involved to arrive promptly. By the time Elias and Mara reached the waiting area, outside Courtroom 3, Trevor was already there, sitting back in his chair with forced confidence, knee bouncing, phone in hand. Karen stood over him, whispering sharply, adjusting his collar like he was about to take a graduation photo rather than face a formal hearing. Karen's eyes snapped toward Elias. The annoyance on her face was immediate, reflexive. "You're early," she said. "No," Elias replied. "I'm prepared." She blinked at the flatness of his tone, expecting sarcasm or defensiveness, not quiet certainty. Then her gaze shifted to Mara, who stood straighter than she had days ago. "You don't have to be scared," Karen told her in a condescending sweetness. "Adults exaggerate things when they want to feel important. Nobody blames you for being confused." Mara's jaw tightened. Before she could speak, Elias stepped forward, not aggressively, but with a composure that stilled the air around them. "She isn't confused," he said. "She's consistent." Karen's false smile faltered. For the first time, she sensed that whatever she expected this hearing to be, it wouldn't follow her script. Deputy Clerk Sanders emerged from the courtroom door. "Judge Branton is ready for everyone." Inside, the courtroom was quiet, but thick with anticipation. Reporters weren't allowed in, but the press always had ways of hearing whispers. Staff filled the gallery benches. A few officers stood by the walls, their posture alert but relaxed. Elias and Mara sat on one side. Karen and Trevor sat on the other, Karen leaning forward as if proximity to the judge's bench would grant her influence. Judge Branton entered, her presence commanding instant silence. She scanned the room once before speaking. "This is a formal hearing regarding unauthorized entry into a restricted evidence room, tampering with secured files, and the subsequent federal alert triggered during the breach." Trevor shifted, and for the first time, a flicker of real worry crossed his face. Branton looked at him directly. "Mr. Whitmore, you'll have the chance to explain your actions shortly." Karen immediately stood. "Your Honor, before we begin, I'd like to request—" "Sit," Branton said. Not shouted, just firm enough to feel like a closing door. Karen froze, then lowered herself back into her seat with stiff movements. Branton then turned to Elias. "Mr. Ward, please present the compiled evidence." Elias stood and approached the front, placing the sealed packet on the bench. The room stayed pinned still as he moved. Mara watched him with a strange mix of awe and familiarity. This calm wasn't new. She had seen it in subtle forms her entire life. But seeing it now, in a place where truth mattered most, brought clarity she hadn't fully grasped until this moment. Branton flipped through the logs, asking for clarification at precise intervals. Elias answered each question with the same patient accuracy he had used while teaching Mara how to solve file tree puzzles as a child. "Explain this time discrepancy," Branton said. "The lock was bypassed at 4:27:16. Camera footage confirms entry at 4:27:18. And this digital footprint matches Mr. Whitmore's device ID," Elias replied, consistent with his login history. Whispers rippled through the gallery. Karen exhaled loudly. "It was a prank. He was curious. He wasn't trying to—" "Mrs. Whitmore," Branton said without looking up, "your interruptions are noted." Karen sank back again, seething. Branton closed the packet and folded her hands. "Mr. Whitmore, you may now give your explanation." Trevor stood reluctantly. He cleared his throat. "It was literally just a joke. I walked in and filmed it. Nothing happened. It wasn't a big deal." "And the federal alert that followed?" Branton asked. Trevor blinked. "What alert?" Karen spoke for him. "Your Honor, That's what we've been trying to clarify. There's no way a teenager walking through a door triggered a federal. That alert, Branton cut in, is currently under review, and that's why we're here. The room went still. Branton shifted her attention to the gallery. Not accusing, just searching. Her gaze paused on Mara. "Miss Ward," she said calmly, "would you approach the bench, please?" Mara froze. Elias turned slightly toward her, nodding once. Steady. Reassuring. Mara stood slowly, clutching the edge of her backpack strap as she stepped forward. The entire room watched her, some in curiosity, some in confusion, Karen in dread. Branton's voice softened. "Miss Ward, I'd like you to verify something for this court." Mara reached into her backpack, fingers trembling only for a moment before closing around the ID case. She placed it on the bench and flipped it open. The badge glinted under the courtroom lights. Gasps broke the silence. Karen's hand flew to her mouth. Trevor's knees nearly buckled. Branton nodded, eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "Thank you, Miss Ward. You may return to your seat." Mara walked back, hands steady now. A different energy filled the room. The first shift of power, unmistakable and irreversible. The truth had stepped into the light, and Karen had nowhere left to run. The courtroom didn't breathe for several seconds after Mara revealed her badge. It was as if the walls themselves needed time to absorb what had just happened. The low murmurs from the gallery weren't disrespectful. They were stunned, recalibrating everything they thought they knew about the quiet girl in the second row. Karen stared at the bench as if the badge were a weapon pointed directly at her reputation. Branton didn't let the moment drag. "This hearing will proceed," she said, voice collected, with full clarity regarding the federal alert and all connected actions. She turned her attention to Elias. "Mr. Ward, I'll need a technical explanation of what occurred when the breach triggered the cadet-level alert." Elias stood, smoothing the front of his modest uniform. Mara watched him with tense anticipation, knowing that this moment, this request, asked him to reveal more of himself than he'd planned. He approached the bench with controlled steps. "When the server room lock was bypassed," he explained, "the system registered unauthorized access to evidence linked to a federal information sharing protocol. Cadet-level monitoring terminals connected to that protocol receive automated pings when breaches occur." Branton nodded thoughtfully. "So, Mara received the alert in real time." "That's correct." Karen abruptly rose. "Your Honor, this is absurd. My son didn't do anything that serious. That badge, that program, it's for children. She must have misinterpreted something." Branton didn't bother looking at her. "Sit." Karen sank down slowly, like someone realizing their footing wasn't as solid as they believed. Trevor glanced helplessly between his mother and the judge, confusion spreading across his face. The swagger he carried earlier was nowhere to be found. He suddenly looked like an ordinary teenager who'd taken a leap he never expected to land this hard. Branton leaned slightly forward. "Mr. Ward, please continue." Elias clicked the courtroom monitor on. A single image appeared, a time-stamped access log, the exact moment Trevor entered the server room. "This is the initial entry point," he said, followed by the system's detection of unauthorized video capture. Another log appeared, then another, each one aligned with the exact second Trevor bypassed the lock and triggered the system reaction. It was a precise chain, hard to argue with, impossible to dismiss. Karen shot to her feet again. "This is a misunderstanding. You're blowing my son's actions out of proportion. He didn't break anything. He's a kid. He explores. He jokes." "Jokes don't override secure access locks," Elias said calmly. The words landed with a weight Karen hadn't anticipated. Not mocking, not emotional, just factual, unarguable. It silenced the gallery instantly. Branton raised one hand. "Mrs. Whitmore, if you interrupt one more time, I'll have you removed." Karen's face twisted, but she sat. Trevor swallowed hard. His voice came out small when he spoke. "I didn't think anything would happen. The door wasn't even fully locked. I just pushed it. Filmed. That's it." "And why did you film it?" Branton asked. He hesitated. "Because people online think that stuff is funny." Branton stared at him for a long moment. "Did you consider the severity of what that room contains?" Trevor shook his head. "No," Karen quickly added. "He didn't know. You can't punish a child for not understanding technology." Elias turned slightly. He didn't need to understand the technology. He needed to understand boundaries. Mara's gaze softened toward her father, recognizing the quiet conviction she'd seen him live by every day. Branton continued reviewing the logs. "Mr. Ward, you seem exceptionally familiar with these systems." A hush fell across the courtroom. This was the moment Elias had hoped to avoid, the moment when his past edged into the present. He answered carefully. "I've worked with evidence preservation and digital security before." Karen scoffed. "Before you became a maintenance worker?" Elias didn't react to the jab. "Yes." Branton considered him with newfound depth, but didn't press. Instead, she pivoted back to Trevor. "Mr. Whitmore, the issue isn't simply walking into a room. The issue is the chain reaction your entry caused. Evidence contamination, protocol breach, digital trail compromise, and a federal alert routed through the cyber cadet network." Trevor's face paled. Karen opened her mouth again, but this time even Trevor quietly whispered, "Mom, stop." Karen froze, stunned. Branton closed the packet with a firm snap. "This court needs to determine whether your actions were negligent or knowingly reckless. The logs make clear that a breach occurred. The alert makes clear that it reached federal review." Trevor whispered, "I didn't know it'd go that far." "That," Branton replied, "is exactly the problem." Mara shifted, eyes flicking to her father. She felt the shift in the room, a turning tide that no amount of Karen's influence could reverse. Branton gestured toward Elias again. "Your system reconstruction was detailed, far more than I expected from your position." Elias inclined his head slightly. "I believe in maintaining accuracy, regardless of role." Karen snorted, her frustration breaking through again. "Accuracy? You're just trying to sound important." Branton's eyes snapped toward her, voice sharp as steel. "Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Ward's evidence is the only reason this courthouse isn't currently under federal suspension. I suggest you stop underestimating the people who keep this building functioning." The room went silent, completely silent. Elias remained composed, but Mara saw something flicker behind his eyes. Not pride, but vindication. Karen sat frozen, caught between disbelief and dawning fear. Trevor lowered his head, shoulders shrinking inward. Branton lifted her gavel just slightly. "We're not done. There is still the matter of determining accountability, and what must be done to prevent this from ever happening again." Elias returned to his seat, Mara leaning subtly toward him, drawing courage from his presence. Power had shifted, and Karen knew it. The gavel's soft thud lingered in the air long after Judge Branton lowered it, as if the sound itself was unwilling to leave the room. Trevor slumped in his chair, staring at the table like it might swallow him. Karen sat rigid, fingers twisting around the handle of her designer purse, fury and fear threading through her expression in equal measure. Elias stayed composed, but Mara could feel the tension pulsing under his calm. She knew the next phase of the hearing would demand even more truth than the last. Branton leaned back in her chair. "Before this court determines consequences," she said, "I need a deeper understanding of what happened, and why." Her gaze shifted to the bailiff. "Bring the security footage." The lights dimmed slightly as the monitor flickered on. The footage began with a hallway view. Trevor and two friends approaching the server room, laughing, nudging each other. Mara's stomach twisted. She remembered how that laughter echoed in reality, careless and sharp. Then the feed showed Trevor pushing the door, slipping inside, phone raised like a spotlight. 2 seconds later, the bypass alert appeared in the corner of the screen. Branton paused the footage. "Mr. Whitmore, do you dispute this?" Trevor shook his head, voice barely audible. "No." Karen shot him a sharp look, but he didn't lift his eyes. Branton pressed play again. The recording showed Trevor filming racks of evidence drives, zooming in on labels, making jokes about government secrets. His friends laughed. The footage ended with them running out, one almost tripping as the motion sensor triggered a second alert. Branton turned to Elias. "Mr. Ward, please explain the significance of what he filmed." Elias stepped forward. "Those drives contain evidence from ongoing investigations, some state, some federal. If their chain of custody is questioned, cases can collapse." Karen barked out a forced laugh. "Collapse cases? From a teen holding a phone?" Honestly, Your Honor, let's not pretend this man isn't exaggerating to make himself relevant. Branton didn't respond to her directly. She addressed Elias again. In your analysis, did the breach cause data alteration? No, Elias replied. The system integrity held, but the attempt alone compromises trust. And how do you know it held? She asked. Elias hesitated for only half a second, a flicker so small only Mara noticed. Because I verified the hashes myself. The room inhaled as one. Mara felt her heart climb into her throat. She knew what that meant. She knew how complex that verification was. And she knew her father had just revealed a skill a courthouse maintenance tech wasn't supposed to have. Karen pounced. Hashes? Really? What kind of janitor talks like that? Branton's patience fractured. Mrs. Whitmore, enough. Karen glared but fell silent. Branton folded her hands. Mr. Ward, I'm going to ask you something plainly. You may decline to answer if it involves previous classified work. Are you trained in forensic data integrity? Mara's breath stopped. Trevor's head shot up. The gallery leaned forward. Elias didn't dodge. He didn't deflect. He simply met the judge's eyes. Yes, Karen sputtered. What? From where? A YouTube tutorial? Branton's eyebrow lifted. Mrs. Whitmore, sit back. Elias continued, tone even. Before my wife died, I worked as a federal digital forensics analyst. Evidence security, intrusion mapping, and chain of custody management were part of my daily responsibilities. Mara felt her lungs unlock, not in shock, but in recognition. The pieces she hadn't known how to place suddenly aligned. Every precise movement, every calm decision. Every late night he'd said he was just helping the courthouse stay organized. None of it was simple. None of it was accidental. In the gallery, a wave of murmurs rose. Branton absorbed the reveal without visible surprise, confirming she'd suspected this long before Karen did. Thank you for your clarity, Mr. Ward, Karen finally snapped. This is ridiculous. He's lying. He cleans floors. He tightens screws. He is not some federal expert. Her voice echoed off the walls like a tantrum. Elias didn't so much as blink. My job title doesn't erase my past. Branton let the moment settle before speaking. Mrs. Whitmore, the only person undermining themselves here is you. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it when Trevor tugged on her sleeve. His eyes were wide with something she hadn't expected. Not fear, but realization that his mother's outbursts were making things worse. Branton tapped her gavel lightly. Let's proceed, Mr. Whitmore. Given the federal involvement and the nature of the breach, why did you think filming inside a restricted room was harmless? Trevor swallowed. It didn't look dangerous. The door was half open. I thought it meant anyone could go in. Branton looked at Elias. Is that accurate? No, Elias said. I was repairing the lock when the breach occurred. It was halfway through the cycle, not unlocked. Trevor's shoulders sagged. Karen jumped in again. He's a child. He saw a door open and went inside. That's not a crime. It's a mistake. Branton's patience snapped cleanly. Mrs. Whitmore, your son didn't just walk through a door. He recorded sensitive evidence, triggered a system alert, and caused federal involvement. Intent may be unclear, but impact is not. Silence smothered the room. Branton then turned to Mara. Miss Ward, when you received the alert, what did you do? Mara stood slowly. I followed protocol from my program. I authenticated it, checked the timestamp, and reported it to the system supervisor. And did you know who caused it at that time? No, she said quietly. Trevor flinched. Karen whispered, This is unreal. Branton nodded. Thank you, Miss Ward. You may sit. Mara returned to her seat, shoulders squared, breath steadied. The judge scanned the room one final time. The facts are clear. The breach occurred. The federal alert was valid, and the court must determine appropriate consequences. Karen closed her eyes, as if bracing for impact. Elias rested a hand subtly on Mara's arm, a silent promise of stability. The truth had expanded, the lies were shrinking, and the courtroom's balance had shifted for good. The courtroom air felt different now, not lighter, not heavier, but sharpened, as if every person inside suddenly understood the gravity of what they'd witnessed. Judge Brandon set Trevor's admission and Elias's revelation aside for a moment, letting silence stretch long enough for consequences to take shape in their minds. Karen sat stiffly, fingers trembling around her purse strap. She finally understood she was no longer steering anything. Mara sat straight, hands clasped in her lap, drawing steady breaths the way her dad had quietly taught her for years. Branton lifted a page from her desk. Before I determine penalties or next steps, this court needs one final clarification. Her eyes drifted to Elias again. Given your experience, would you say this breach could have led to a shutdown of this courthouse's federal access? Elias didn't hesitate. Yes, if left unreported, the integrity warning would have escalated automatically. A gasp rippled across the gallery. It wasn't fear. It was dawning comprehension. Karen's eyes widened, panic flickering across her features. That's impossible. You're exaggerating. You're trying to make my son look like he endangered the country. No, Elias replied, voice even. I'm explaining what the system would have done, not what I wish it had done. Trevor swallowed hard, finally looking up at the judge. I didn't mean to cause all that. Branton nodded once. Intent is noted. Consequences are still required. She looked toward the bailiff. Bring in the supplemental report. The bailiff placed a thick folder on her bench. Karen's posture stiffened when Branton opened it. Even from the gallery, people sensed this was something Karen hoped would never surface. Branton scanned a page. Mrs. Whitmore, you attempted to access the secured video logs yesterday morning. Is that correct? Karen's face froze. She glanced at the audience. She hated witnesses, then forced a thin smile. I was simply trying to understand what happened, a concerned parent. You used your counsel credentials, Branton continued, to pressure 3 employees for access you are not authorized to have. The room murmured. Karen stuttered. Well, I was told. By whom? Branton asked. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She had no answer. Trevor sank lower in his seat. Branton closed the folder with a decisive snap. This hearing is about accountability, not influence, and the evidence shows a consistent attempt to manipulate the situation by downplaying the breach and disrupting proper procedure. Mara looked at her father, and for the first time, she saw something shift in his eyes. Not anger, not triumph, resolve. This was the part of him she'd never fully understood, the part that stood for truth when others tried to drown it in noise. Branton turned to the gallery. This courthouse operates on trust. When that trust is breached by anyone, it affects every case, every victim, every family waiting for justice. She stood, stepping away from the bench, pacing slowly. Mr. Whitmore, she said, addressing Trevor, you are legally an adult, and adults are responsible for the consequences of their actions. Trevor nodded shakily. I understand. Mrs. Whitmore, Branton continued, your attempts to interfere make this more complicated, but the bulk of accountability falls on your son. Karen clutched her purse, knuckles white. Branton returned to her seat. Mr. Ward, Miss Ward, before I decide on penalties, do either of you wish to add anything? Mara stiffened. She hadn't expected to be asked again. She glanced at Elias, unsure. He gave a small nod, barely perceptible, but enough. Mara rose, voice soft but clear. I don't want his life ruined. I just want people to take the system seriously. They're there for a reason. Trevor looked at her with a stunned expression. Not guilt, but something closer to shame. She continued. People trust that what happens behind these walls is protected. If someone breaks that chain, it doesn't matter if they meant to or not. It still hurts people. It still matters. Branton listened closely. Thank you, Miss Ward. Mara sat, cheeks warm but shoulders squared. Elias stood next. My daughter's right, he said. This isn't about punishment. It's about responsibility. If Mr. Whitmore learns that early, it will protect him more than any attempt to cover this up. For a moment, even Karen had no words. Elias had not used his skill to humiliate anyone. He'd used it to clarify what truth demanded. Branton adjusted her glasses. Very well. She lifted the gavel slightly. Here is my preliminary decision. The entire room leaned forward. Trevor Whitmore, you will complete a mandatory 6-month digital ethics rehabilitation program. You will perform supervised community service within this courthouse, and you will submit a written impact explanation to the Federal Cadet Network addressing why unauthorized access is harmful, regardless of intent. Trevor exhaled shakily, relief, shame, and understanding swirling together. Karen jumped to her feet. Absolutely not. He's not. Sit down, Branton said calmly. Karen slowly sat. Branton continued. Additionally, any future attempts to interfere with ongoing courthouse procedures will result in immediate legal consequences for whoever attempts it. And this time, her eyes landed squarely on Karen. Elias glanced at Mara, who lifted her chin slightly. Truth had taken its rightful place. Branton tapped the gavel once more. This hearing is adjourned. The final documentation will be prepared within the hour. The room erupted into hushed conversation. Mara released a breath she didn't know she was holding. Elias placed a steady hand on her shoulder, solid, grounding, warm. You did well, he murmured. She smiled, small but certain. So did you. As they walked out, whispers followed them. Not in rumor, but in respect. The dynamic had changed, permanently, and justice, quiet, unassuming, unwavering, had finally stepped forward. By the way, if you're still here, subscribe with the bell on because stories like this deserve to be heard. The hallway outside Courtroom 3 felt strangely quiet, quieter than a building packed with tension should feel. It wasn't silence born of fear. It was the settling kind, the way dust drifts down after a storm clears. Elias and Mara walked together, her shoulders no longer tight, his steps steady and unhurried. For the first time since the breach, they weren't bracing. They were simply moving forward. Behind them, Karen's sharp voice echoed faintly through the corridor, her agitation spilling over onto the deputy prosecutor, demanding explanations, demanding reversals, demanding anything that sounded like control. But the responses she received now were clipped, polite, distant. Influence had a half-life. Hers was expiring quickly. Mara exhaled. It's over, she said softly. Almost, Elias replied. There's still documentation. The court needs official closure. She nodded. But the hard part's over. He didn't disagree. Still, something in his eyes reflected caution. Truth settles slowly, he said. But it settles. As they rounded the corner toward the administrative wing, they found Sanders waiting with a folder under his arm. His expression held a mixture of respect and awkwardness. He wasn't quite sure how to recalibrate his perception of Elias after everything. Mr. Ward, Sanders said, straightening slightly. Judge Branton wants your signature on the final verification forms, and she's added a note requesting your technical clarification be attached to the file. Elias nodded. Of course. Sanders hesitated, then looked at Mara. And Miss Ward, the judge would like a short statement from you as well. Something about cadet protocol and why you followed it. Mara blinked, startled. Me? Yes, Sanders said, as though it were the most natural thing. Your testimony was clear. She wants it on record. Mara glanced at her father, seeking reassurance. Elias gave a slight nod. It was enough. As they entered the administrative office, Branton awaited them, glasses off, rubbing the bridge of her nose the way judges do when the job requires more human patience than the robe can carry. She looked up as Elias approached. Mr. Ward, she said, your reconstruction of the breach will be added to the official report. It's thorough, more thorough than I expected. Elias simply replied, accuracy prevents problems later. Branton smiled faintly. I can see where your daughter learned that. Mara flushed, looking down. Branton handed over the verification pages. Once these are signed, this courthouse can finalize its federal compliance response. Karen's shrill voice suddenly sliced through the hallway again. I won't accept this. Do you hear me? I won't let this stand. Branton's jaw tightened, but she didn't move. Instead, she spoke low enough that only Elias and Mara could hear. Some people mistake loudness for power, she said. Don't let it rattle you. Elias glanced toward the hall. It doesn't. Mara followed his gaze and saw Karen arguing with a clerk, her gestures erratic, her tone desperate. Trevor stood behind her, looking drained and embarrassed, the weight of the hearing settling into his posture. He looked less like an entitled teen now, and more like someone who'd finally crashed into a wall he never saw coming. Branton cleared her throat. Before you go, Mr. Ward, one more thing. I know what you withheld in that courtroom. Elias's expression didn't change, but his silence deepened. You left a federal-level career, she continued, and you've been here repairing locks and cables. You didn't need to give this courthouse your expertise, but you did. It's my job, he answered. It's more than that, Branton said. I appreciate it. He nodded once, accepting the acknowledgement without letting it take up too much space. Mara watched the exchange and felt something warm settle inside her. She'd never known the details of his past, but she knew this. Whatever he had been before, he hadn't lost any of it. He just chose where to aim it. They left the office together. In the hallway, Karen abruptly stepped into their path. You think you won? She spat. Elias regarded her with a calm so steady it almost seemed rehearsed. This wasn't about winning. Don't lie to me, she hissed. You humiliated my son. He humiliated himself, Elias said quietly, by ignoring boundaries. Karen looked like she wanted to lash out again, but Trevor tugged her sleeve. Mom, stop! She turned, stunned that he'd spoken. Trevor met his mother's eyes with a tired sadness. I messed up. They're right. Karen's anger flickered, then faltered. She didn't apologize. She didn't thank anyone. She simply stepped aside, gripping her purse as if it were the last thing keeping her upright. Elias guided Mara past them toward the exit, not looking back. Outside, cold air wrapped around them, but Mara felt warm. Branton's words echoed in her mind. Her father's steadiness grounded her, and the knowledge that truth had stood firm without shouting made her chest feel impossibly full. Dad, she said quietly. He looked at her. Yes? Why didn't you tell the judge everything? About your old job? He considered his answer. Because the truth already spoke loud enough. I didn't need to add noise. Mara smiled, understanding him more deeply than she ever had. As they neared the courthouse steps, an older officer called out, Ward! Elias turned. The officer nodded respectfully. Good work today. Elias acknowledged it with a small nod. Nothing more. Mara recognized the moment for what it was, a shift in how people saw him. Not the maintenance man, not the quiet background figure, but the man who held a courtroom together because he understood truth at its foundations. As they walked toward the parking lot, she asked, So, what happens now? Now, Elias said, we go home. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, he replied. We live like we always do. Honest, quiet, and ready. Mara breathed deeply, letting his words settle. Karen's influence had cracked. Trevor had been held accountable. The truth had taken its rightful place in the open, and in the space that followed, dignity returned to where it belonged. The walk home from the courthouse should have felt like an ending, but Elias sensed it was only an intermission. The cold air pressed against his skin, the kind of cold that hinted at unfinished business. Mara walked close to him, relief still softening her features, but her mind was clearly replaying what had happened. Every few steps, she glanced at him, curious, proud, and a little overwhelmed. They reached their apartment, and she slipped inside first, dropping her backpack near the door. Elias paused before entering. Years of habit, listening, scanning, settling, never left him. Only when he felt the quiet sit properly around them did he step inside. Mara kicked off her shoes and turned to him. Dad, that was intense. I didn't know the judge would ask for a statement from me. You spoke well, he said, hanging his coat. You spoke truth. She smiled, but worry crept behind it. Karen looked like she wanted to tear us apart. Do you think she'll try something else? She might, he said honestly, but she has less ground than she thinks. Mara sank onto the couch. Because Trevor admitted everything? Because the public exposure is done, Elias replied. Attempting more would only sink her deeper. Mara considered this, nodding slowly as she absorbed the difference between noise and consequence. Not long after, Elias's phone buzzed on the counter. A message from the courthouse. Final documentation ready for verification. Signatures required by end of day. He didn't sigh. He didn't complain. He simply picked up the phone and grabbed his keys. I'll go back, he said. I'm coming, Mara insisted, sliding off the couch. He shook his head. You rest. You did enough for today. She hesitated, then followed him to the doorway anyway. Then come back fast, okay? He gave a faint smile. Always. Back at the courthouse, the halls were quieter than before. Staff moved more gently, like people who had finally realized the building demanded more respect than gossip. When Elias reached the administrative office, Saunders handed him a prepared folder with a cautious, almost deferential nod. "Judge Branton added your technical assessment to the final record," Saunders said. "She said it was instrumental." Elias didn't react outwardly, but something shifted behind his eyes. Recognition, not pride. It wasn't the first time a judge had used the word. It had been whispered across FBI conference rooms, written on classified documents, spoken by supervisors who expected perfection from him. Perfection he delivered until grief shattered the rhythm. He signed each page carefully. No rush, no wasted movement. Accuracy mattered. When he finished, Saunders hesitated. "Ward, can I ask something?" Elias looked up. "Go ahead." "Why are you working maintenance? I mean, no judgment. You're clearly not only that." Elias closed the folder. "Sometimes people choose quiet. It's not always a downgrade. Sometimes it's healing." Saunders nodded slowly. "Makes sense." As Elias left the office, a voice echoed from down the hall, sharp, cracking under strain. "You can't be serious. This can't be the final ruling." Karen. Again. Elias didn't change direction, but her voice grew louder as she approached the main corridor. He turned a corner just as Karen emerged from the clerk's station, her expression a chaotic mix of anger and disbelief. Trevor followed several steps behind, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the floor. When Karen spotted Elias, her fury sharpened like a blade. "This is your fault." He stopped. "No, it's the result of actions taken and recorded." "You manipulated the judge," she snapped. "You manipulated the entire hearing with your past." "My past wasn't part of the decision," he replied calmly. "The logs were." Karen stumbled over her words, desperate for a foothold. "You knew exactly what would happen when you presented them." "I knew the truth would be clear," he said. Trevor rubbed his forehead. "Mom, just stop, please." Karen ignored him. "You think this makes you noble? You think exposing us makes you some kind of hero? You humiliated my son." "He humiliated himself," Elias said quietly. "I just showed what happened." Karen's voice cracked. "He's not a criminal." "No," Elias agreed. "He's someone who needed to learn respect for systems that protect people." Trevor's eyes lifted for the first time, meeting Elias's. I get it now. I really do." Karen froze, stunned. "Trevor?" He shook his head. "Mom, I messed up, and everyone saw it. I'm not blaming him. He hesitated, then finished awkwardly. "He's right." A long silence stretched between them. Karen looked from Trevor to Elias, something in her expression breaking. Not softness, not remorse, but the first edge of realization that her influence could no longer shield her from consequences. Trevor stepped forward a little. "Mr. Ward, I'm sorry, I mean it." Elias nodded once. "Then use the program well. It's meant to help." He didn't offer more comfort. He didn't offer forgiveness. He simply acknowledged the apology without cheapening it. Karen let out a hollow breath, like her entire argument had finally run out of air. I just wanted to protect him," she whispered. Elias didn't answer. Protection wasn't covering mistakes. Protection was guiding someone through accountability. Trevor gently took his mother's arm. "Let's go home." Karen didn't resist this time. Elias watched them leave, not triumphant, not vengeful, simply steady. The hearing had ended hours ago, but the real shift was happening here, in this quiet corridor where consequences finally outweighed arrogance. When Elias returned home, Mara stood up instantly. "Everything okay?" "Yes," he said, removing his coat. "It's done." "What happened?" He met her eyes. "People saw the truth, and sometimes that's enough." Mara exhaled, a smile breaking through. "Then we can finally breathe?" He nodded. "We can." That night, their apartment felt warmer, quieter, finally free. And for the first time in days, Elias allowed himself to rest. Morning light seeped into the apartment, with a gentleness that hadn't been there in days. It moved across the living room like a soft acknowledgement that the weight pressing on Elias and Mara had finally begun to lift. Elias woke before his alarm, out of habit rather than tension. For the first time in weeks, his mind wasn't racing ahead to evidence logs, courthouse politics, or Karen's relentless noise. He simply breathed. Mara shuffled into the kitchen moments later, hair messy, face still soft with sleep. "You slept," she said, not as a question, but as a small celebration. "A little," he admitted, cracking eggs into a pan. "A little is still progress." She sat at the table, tucking her legs beneath her. "Do we go in today?" "We should," Elias said. "There are final confirmations. Judge Branton wants the system checks verified, and Trevor starts his supervised service." Mara nodded, processing the weight of that. The courthouse wasn't just a building anymore. It was a place where truth had stood its ground, because they'd stood theirs. On their walk, the air felt clearer, crisp but livable. Every step brought them closer to a building that no longer felt hostile. It felt watchful, maybe, or respectful. As they reached the entrance, Officer Ramirez gave a warm nod. "You two all right?" he asked. "We're good," Mara replied before her father could. Her voice didn't shake. It carried something new, subtle confidence. Inside, the usual crowd lingered. Today, though, something had changed in the way people looked at them. Not avoidance, not judgment. A quiet acknowledgement. Some nods, a few small smiles. When they reached the administrative wing, they found Trevor standing near the service desk, holding a clipboard awkwardly. He wore plain jeans, a hoodie, and a nervous expression. Karen wasn't with him, an absence that said more than any outburst she could have thrown. Trevor lifted a hand in an uncertain wave. "Mr. Ward?" Elias paused. "Yes?" Trevor stepped closer, swallowing hard. "I wanted to say sorry again, for everything. I started my service today. They said you might supervise some of it." Mara blinked. "Wait, what?" Trevor rubbed the back of his neck. "Judge Branton said part of my program involves understanding the courthouse from every angle, including the parts people ignore." Elias listened without expression. "And what do you understand so far?" Trevor hesitated, then answered honestly, "That I didn't know anything. It wasn't polished, it wasn't perfect, but it was real." Elias nodded. "Then you're starting from the right place." A breath left Trevor like a release. "Thanks." He turned to Mara, cheeks flushing slightly. "And, sorry for calling you dramatic that day." Mara raised an eyebrow. "I didn't hear you call me dramatic." "You didn't," he said, face burning. "But I said it to my friends, right before all this happened." She looked at him for a long moment before replying, "Well, you won't make that mistake again." "Definitely not," he said. Sanders appeared with a stack of papers, interrupting the moment. "Ward, Branton wants a final confirmation of the system integrity. Just one more pass-through." Elias nodded. "We'll handle it." Mara followed him to the server room, her steps lighter now. As he opened the secure door, the faint hum of machines filled the space. This room, this quiet, high-stakes space, had been the start of everything. "What do we have to check?" Mara asked, stepping inside. "System logs, hash verifications, access trails. We make sure nothing's lingering." She nodded, watching his hands move skillfully across the interface. She'd seen him fix countless things. Doors, wires, broken lights. But this was different. The depth, the precision, the familiarity. She finally saw him as the man he'd once been, and the man he chose to be now. "You used to do this every day?" she asked softly. He didn't stop typing. "Every day. And you gave it up for us?" He finally looked at her. "No, I gave it up for you. For stability, for quiet. I wanted a life where you didn't have to live inside my work." Mara swallowed. "Would you ever go back?" He paused, not long enough to suggest doubt, but long enough to suggest honesty. "Only if it aligned with the life we built, not instead of it." Mara smiled slowly. "I think Mom would be proud." He didn't speak for a moment, then, quietly, "I hope so." When they stepped back into the hallway, Branton stood waiting. She regarded Elias with professional respect and Mara with something gentler. "The federal notice has been cleared," Branton said. "Your actions prevented escalation, and your daughter's alert was treated exactly as it should be, responsibly." Mara straightened. "Thank you, Your Honor." Branton shifted her attention to Elias. "And Mr. Ward, this courthouse is safer because of what you did, and because of what you chose not to hide." "I didn't do anything extraordinary," he said. "Extraordinary," Branton replied, "is often just quiet work done correctly when it matters." Elias didn't answer, but the words struck him deeper than any praise could have. As Branton left, Trevor passed by carrying cleaning supplies, heading toward the gallery benches. He nodded respectfully at them both. Karen lingered far behind him, watching in silence, no longer fueled by rage, just the reality of what had unfolded. Outside, Mara and Elias walked toward the exit as late morning sunlight spilled across the floor. "Dad?" Mara asked. "Yes? Does this mean everything's done?" He considered the hallway, the echoes of the past days, the shift in perception, the restored dignity. "Almost," he said. "There's one more thing." "And what's that?" "We go home," he answered, "and live with clarity." She smiled. "That sounds like enough." For the first time since the breach, the world felt quiet, and this time, the quiet felt earned. The sun was higher now, warming the courthouse steps as Elias and Mara walked out together. The cold that had clung to the past week finally loosened its grip, lifting from their shoulders with each step they took toward the parking lot. It wasn't dramatic or triumphant. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after truth settles into its rightful place. They reached the car, and Mara paused before getting in, turning to look back at the courthouse. "It feels different now," she said softly, "like it's not against us anymore." "It never was," Elias replied, unlocking the doors. "People make noise. Systems wait for truth." She absorbed that as she climbed in. He drove in silence for a few minutes, city streets passing by in gentle blurs. For the first time, Mara didn't feel the urge to replay every detail of the hearing. She didn't feel guilty or afraid or uncertain. She felt steadier, shaped by something she'd been thrown into without warning, but stronger because she didn't break. When they reached home, she went straight to her room, but not to hide. She opened her tablet, opened her cadet portal, and read the confirmation that her report had been authenticated and archived by Federal Review. A small notification blinked at the top. Protocol compliance, excellent response time, immediate accuracy, verified. She stared at it, stunned. She'd never thought of herself as someone the system relied on. She'd just wanted to do the right thing. And she had. In the living room, Elias folded his coat over the chair, taking a slow moment to breathe. The apartment didn't feel like a refuge from pressure anymore. It felt like home again, simple and steady. He walked to the kitchen, filled the kettle, and set it on the stove. When it began to hiss, he didn't rush to silence it. The sound felt normal again. Mara joined him a minute later, leaning against the counter. "Everyone looked at us differently today," she said. "Not weird, just different." "They saw clearly," he said. "Clarity tends to shift things." "And Karen?" she asked. "She has a path to walk now. Consequences, responsibility." He poured her tea. "Sometimes that's the beginning of something better. Sometimes it's just the beginning of truth catching up." Mara cupped the warm mug in her hands. "Trevor didn't seem like a bad person today, just lost." "He has the chance to find direction," Elias said, "if he chooses it." She thought about Trevor scrubbing benches with the cleaning crew, eyes lowered, no arrogance left in his posture. "Do you think he will?" "That's up to him," Elias answered, "but impact teaches faster than privilege." She nodded, letting the words settle between them. She'd seen it firsthand, how arrogance crumbled under the weight of real consequences, how noise faded when truth finally spoke, how a courtroom filled with power and politics could suddenly refocus when faced with undeniable evidence. After they finished their tea, they stepped out onto the small balcony, letting the breeze move around them. Cars hummed below. People passed by with grocery bags and backpacks and hurried conversations. Life had already moved on, but something had changed in them. "Dad," Mara said, voice soft, "I know you didn't tell the judge everything, about your job before, about what you actually did." "I told her enough," he replied. "But why didn't you tell me?" He rested his forearms on the railing. "Because I didn't want my past to shape your future. I didn't want you to grow up with fear around every corner, wondering what world your father was part of. She looked at him, eyes full of quiet understanding. But it's part of you. Yes, he said. But it doesn't define what comes next. That's for you and me to build. She smiled at that. Not the shy smile she used to hide behind, but something clearer, stronger. As the afternoon sun settled across their balcony, Mara leaned her head lightly on his shoulder. "I'm glad we stood up," she murmured, "even when it felt scary." "You stood exactly how you were meant to," he said. "Truth doesn't need confidence, just consistency." She breathed in the warmth around them. "Do you think everyone at the courthouse will remember what happened?" "Maybe," he said, "but what matters is what you remember." She closed her eyes for a moment. "That doing the right thing matters." "Yes," he said softly, "even when noise tries to drown it out." Evening came slowly, stretching long shadows across the balcony tiles. The week that once felt like a storm now seemed distant, softened by resolution. The breach had been handled. Karen's influence had collapsed under its own weight. Trevor had begun the hardest lesson of his life, and Elias had reclaimed a piece of himself he didn't realize he'd buried so deeply. As they stepped back inside, Mara turned to him once more. "Dad?" "Yes?" "Thank you. For everything?" He smiled, the warm, quiet smile she trusted more than anything. "Always." And in that small apartment, under soft yellow light, father and daughter finally felt the world settle around them. Honest, calm, and earned. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?